We'll move on to sustainable aviation fuels. So, is the department? I don't know whether the right people are at the table. Right.
Shortly.
Thank you. Hello. So, you're the department undertaking work on sustainable aviation fuels?
Ben Vincent, Assistant Secretary, Domestic Policy and Programs Branch. Yes, Senator, the department is supporting the Australian Jet Zero Council.
And how much investment is going into the development of sustainable aviation fuels, with public money being invested?
Well, industry has announced a range of initiatives in decarbonising aviation. Some of those announcements recently include Qantas has a $400 million fund. There have also been a range of operators who have announced they are exploring the production of advanced biofuels.
Mm-hmm. And how much public money is going in?
There was a $30 million ARENA SAF initiative announced.
The Australian Renewable Energy Agency has $30 million in grant funding for sustainable aviation fuel funding. There are a range of other financing mechanisms. Yes, not in our department, Senator. There's a range of other mechanisms that could provide concessional financing for SAF projects, including the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which has increased its capital allocation to $30.5 billion, and they would also potentially be eligible for some of the National Reconstruction Fund's $15 billion of concessional financing.
They will be eligible. So
potentially they would be eligible, yes. I mean, as Ms Purvis-Smith just noted to me, they don't sit in our portfolio, so I can't really comment on who's eligible.
But sustainable aviation fuels does sit in your portfolio.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So, Senator, we are just to clarify that. Yes, we are looking at sustainable aviation fuel in the overall context of decarbonising the transport sector and the aviation sector. We are supporting the Jet Zero Council, which has a work program in relation to decarbonisation of the aviation sector. SAF is one of those work programs, and looking at what that means for the aviation sector. We're also looking at SAF and decarbonisation of the sector through the Green Paper, but we're also working, and it will be part of the roadmap that the Net Zero Unit is looking at, to look at the whole of the sector.
The sectors of the aviation.
The aviation. Well,
okay.
The roadmap will look at the whole of the transport sector and also infrastructure sector, not just the aviation sector.
I do want to focus on aviation at the moment. What other measures are being looked at for decarbonisation of aviation?
So those processes are still underway. You've got the Green Paper and the Jet Zero Council that are still underway. So decisions are still yet to be made. As Ms Werner mentioned, there are funds in other portfolios that are not controlled by us. We don't control any direct funding in terms of SAF.
Yep.
So the funding in terms of biofuels sit in other portfolios. Yep. For example, BP, Kwinana, Green.
Look, I understood.
Hydrogen.
I actually didn't want to get into the funding for SAF. I was just interested to know the quantum of public funding that was going into it. What other decarbonisation measures? Are there other decarbonisation measures being considered in a broad...
Safeguard mechanism, Senator, which Qantas and Virgin are both subject to.
And so the safeguard mechanism, how would that then lead to decarbonisation of aviation?
Well, Qantas and Virgin, I mean, again, it's not in our portfolio, but they're required to reduce their emissions by 4.9% each year to 2030 under the safeguard mechanism, so that would reduce emissions from aviation.
But you'd presume that how are they planning on doing that? Would it be largely through sustainable aviation fuels?
Well, how they do it is a question for them.
It's a question for them, but there are... So, for example, sustainable aviation fuels is a medium-term fuel for the decarbonisation of the aviation sector, but it is not the only way that the aviation sector can decarbonise. For the smaller end of the aviation sector, so for and particularly short haul, electrification is a real option. Electrification with fuel cell as well. There are companies that are looking at that and looking to use to fly the first electrified flight in 18 months to 2 years. So there are
in Australia. There have been other electrified flights in the world.
That's right. In Australia, that's right. New Zealand are actually putting a lot of work on electrification of short haul in New Zealand. For short haul flights. So then hydrogen for long haul is a long term prospect for decarbonisation. That is definitely a long term prospect. A lot of work needs to go into potentially redesigning large jets in order to be able to use hydrogen fuel. In the medium term, biofuels and SAF will be important for the aviation sector.
Is the department doing any modelling as to whether actual emissions reductions are going to occur with uptake of SAF compared with increase in the number of flights?
So it depends. We're not doing modelling in terms of scenarios. You may be aware that there are some scenarios in the Green Paper that go through what the future could look like, but they are scenarios, they're not forecasts, and they were designed to get people to think, to look over the horizon, to look at what different scenarios might look like, but they were not forecasts. So we haven't done modelling or forecasts in that way.
Given that you haven't done modelling, are you confident that the use of SAF would result in an overall actual decrease in emissions?
We're looking at work. We're doing work on SAF and a lot of work on SAF, and we're also working with other departments, including the Department of Climate Change, and also looking at what SAF does. So, for example, not all SAFs are alike in a way, which might go some way to your question.
My point is that the Green Paper says that we're looking at a tripling of flight movements.
Well, that is a scenario. That's not a forecast that there will be a tripling. That is a scenario. There are a range of scenarios.
Senator, can I just add, sorry, I think I misunderstood your question before. So there's a range of ways in which aviation could decarbonise. One way is increasingly fuel-efficient aircraft, so that's probably the most immediate way that Virgin and Qantas would seek to reduce their carbon emissions. As Ms Pepper-Smith mentioned, Rex Airlines has a partnership with Dovetail Electric Aviation to try and electrify the shorter haul regional flights. Skytrans has an alliance with Brisbane Airport Corporation and other organisations to form the Hydrogen Flight Alliance, which is trying to develop a hydrogen electric demonstrator which will fly in Australia in 2024. Potentially there are some efficiencies to be had through airspace operations, although our airspace management is reasonably advanced and there may be limited efficiencies available there. And then other than that, the most promising prospect, yes, is SAF.
Okay. Look, I acknowledge that you said it's just one scenario of the tripling of flight movements, but that is currently that's considered to be a reasonable scenario.
I'm not sure I'd say it's a reasonable scenario or a forecast. The scenarios that we put together in the Green Paper was really to get people to, stick their heads up over the parapet and to look at all the range of scenarios. Those scenarios are not forecasts and they're not predictions of what we think will happen.
If you had that scenario of a tripling of flight movements, and would you have an actual reduction of emissions with SAF and the other measure that you're talking by 2050?
I think that would be a hypothetical question, Senator.
Well, we're putting together a roadmap to ensure that we can meet Australia's international treaty obligations, including by 2050. Some modes of transport, we've talked about at length about fuel efficiency standards for light vehicles, have a reasonably well-defined pathway. Others are more speculative in technological terms, and so as we move towards that, goal, we will be taking into account the demand side for transport, which is significant and has increased in recent times and is set to continue, and that merely increases the need to achieve abatement in order to achieve...
Are you looking at
targets.
mode shift as well?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a marginal abatement cost curve, so we look at all the different component parts and we try to solve the biggest problems first.
Are you looking at
once-
mode shift with relation to high-speed rail also? Is that a scenario?
High-speed rail is on the government's agenda, yes.
Yes. So in terms of your mode shift and not having this scenario of a tripling of flights,
Then that would become a relevant consideration, yeah. We can
So-
talk, talk about the work of the High Speed Rail Authority when you
Yes.
like, but they're giving evidence a bit later on this evening.
so that work that you're doing, what's the timeline on that?
For High Speed Rail?
No, in your various scenarios of mapping out that road, of putting together that roadmap.
Well, that was described under the corporate item for the net zero unit this morning, but the intention is that by the end of the year we will have a version of that roadmap, or early next year, for the purposes of public consultation.
Okay. Can I just go back to SAF and the concerns that have been raised about it, including insufficient production capacity for it to reach scale, potentially high cost, prohibitively high cost as a barrier to uptake, environmental concerns regarding the amount of biomass required for SAF, and that it won't be an effective solution in the required time frame. So is the Department aware of these criticisms, and how do you respond to them?
We are aware of them. We're still working through, as we mentioned. I'm not sure if you're aware of the CSIRO paper on SAF, and they go through a lot of information, a lot of the issues, and also a lot of the opportunities and potential for us to meet our SAF requirements within Australia. So there are a lot of issues that we're working through at the moment, and including one that I think I touched on just before was certification of SAF. As you're probably implying, I think not all SAF is alike. So we're working with the Department of Climate Change to certify SAF so that you do get something that's consistent across SAFs rather than one, and sustainable. There might be, for example, your concern around not everything might be sustainable. In the certification, sustainable has a definition, so that we are working with the Department of Climate Change around that.
So are you confident that those concerns that have been raised are all able to be overcome?
We're working through that at the moment. I think that, SAF is still a new, nascent market. It is only available in very small quantities, so we are still working through all of those issues.
Okay. One last question about Brisbane Airport Corporation. They provide an assurance on their website that they'll be a net zero airport by 2025. However, that being a net zero airport doesn't include emissions from flights to and from the airport, and therefore could be considered misleading advertising. Are you aware of that claim that they're making?
It's a privately owned corporation.
Yeah,
But you regulate them?
Not to that. We regulate airports, but we don't regulate to that extent in that way. We do know Brisbane Airport have presented to us on the types of things they're looking at doing to be able to make themselves net zero, excluding flights, absolutely. But there is also a lot of work that airports can do, landside and airside, in order to move down that road.
Do you think that the potential claim that they'll be a net zero airport by 2025, excluding flights, there is a case that that's misleading advertising?
I think that would go to an opinion.
We couldn't offer an opinion on that.
I mean,
we can talk about Western Sydney Airport, which we are responsible for and which will achieve those environmental targets by 2026 when it opens for business.
But excluding flights once again?
Of course. I mean, it's an airport. It
So you
can't
don't think that-
decarbonise.
So you think if Western Sydney Airport was saying that they were a net zero airport,
The only
that
way it could
wouldn't
be a
misleading?
true complete net zero airport would be for it not to take any flights.
Have you taken any? Well, given
Which would kind of be a bit silly.
exactly. And that's the exact point, is that can you actually have a net zero airport?
So the government is not opposed to aviation at this stage.
Animal protein, and we won't fly.
But you can't claim that you are net zero if, in fact, the whole purpose of the airport is generating massive amounts of carbon emissions.
Except that you can look at those functions which are performed by an airport and ensure that you're absolutely minimising the carbon footprint of those things which are within your control, which is what the Western Sydney Airport government business-owned enterprise is, to its great credit, attempting to do.
So, okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.